Well, I'm fortunate, I suppose, in that I actually was present when the society was founded in 1969, and my then thesis supervisor, Barney Sampson, became the first president. I joined the society in 1970 when I was appointed as a lecturer in psychology here at the University of Canterbury, and got involved in particularly the organisation of conferences quite a lot in the decades that followed. So I guess my perspective is mostly influenced by what I've seen in terms of the kinds of things that are presented at the conferences. And when I joined and when I first started presenting at conferences, and then later in the 1970s getting involved in the organisation of conferences, the society was still in its early phase of being dominated by academics in the universities. There weren't a lot of clinical psychologists, and so most of the conference programs, for example, were fairly conventional presentations of academic research. So, for example, the first paper that I presented, which was a conference in Dunedin in 1970, was about a phenomenon called behavioural contrast, which happens when you run pigeons in experiments in particular ways, and I gave that paper along with David Baldock, who's subsequently had a career in the United States and in Australia as an academic psychologist. That particular kind of research in operant behaviour actually came to dominate the society more and more in its conferences over the ensuing decade of the 1970s, because what was initially an informal group and later became the Division for Behaviour Analysis attracted more and more and more students. It was a very strong domain within New Zealand psychology, but other things were also represented, particularly in cognitive and perception. I think that period of domination of the conference programs by essentially academic research really started to come to an end in the 1970s, and towards the end of the 1970s and in the 1980s. And one of the things that happened at that point actually was that the behaviourists decamped and started holding their own conferences. They became ultimately another separate organisation, a chapter of the Association for Behaviour Analysis International, and they've run their own conferences ever since, very often in fact in the same month and on the same weekend as the Psych Society conferences. It's actually been difficult to maintain links to both organisations, and you know, there were some particular sort of unfortunate political reasons, I think, for that split, which has been to the disadvantage of both behavioural psychology and psychology more generally in New Zealand, I think, but that's another story perhaps. What happened after the 1970s really was a rather muddly period in which there was a loss of influence by academics, and the growing strength of applied and particularly clinical psychologists began to be felt. I think there was a perception at the time that the focus of the society on supporting research and on the nature of its program at its conferences led to growing dissatisfaction among clinical psychologists. They felt they were not getting a fair share of the time and the attention of the conference organisation, and part of that dissatisfaction led in the late 1980s to, again, the separation from the society of the College of Clinical Psychologists. And again, I think that was actually an unfortunate development. I think that for a number of years, actually, research was not particularly a feature of the conference program, or really particularly central to the thinking of the society. This sort of working through of the consequences of the growth of clinical and applied psychology and of a sort of rebalancing between what was conventionally an academic and learned society and what became much more a professional organisation actually took a number of years and wasn't an easy transition to make. One of the things that did help this, I think, was that the IO psychologists remained strongly committed to working within the society, and over the years the IO program and the research reported in the IO program at the conference has actually become stronger and stronger. And so even in years when the overall conference program was a bit thin on the ground, particularly from a research perspective, there was always a strong IO program, and then the development of the Institute of Clinical Psychology led to a rediscovery, I think, of research as a focus within the broader professional context of the new sort of what became almost sort of the new society, really, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The other thing that of course also was really quite distinctive, and it would be fun to go through the conference programs and actually quantitatively track this, was the growing emphasis on having a bicultural stream within the conference program, where bicultural research was featured. And this has become, again, a consistent element in the conference programs. And it's interesting, not least because it's become a place where essentially qualitative research is the dominant research methodology. And I think that having a place in the conference programs for both Maori researchers, Maori students particularly, find a home there, I think, to present their work, and more generally having a theme in the conference program which is dominated by, in fact often is exclusively concerned with research coming out of the qualitative research tradition, has again sort of valorised that kind of research, and it's made it much more acceptable, although it's not particularly acceptable within most of the academic domains within New Zealand psychology to this day. Looking at the situation as it exists in the 21st century, I think that in fact the society has emerged into a kind of new balance. There is still space within the research programs in the conference for the more traditional academic research, but the quality as well as the quantity of research reflecting applied and clinical psychology and also the bicultural perspective has grown so that the conference programs are now typically fairly well-balanced menus, I think, for most of the membership of the society. The other thing that I'm personally proud of is that as the Director for Scientific Affairs on the Society's Council in the early 2000s, I instituted a much longer term view about the kinds of invited keynote speakers we should get. Up to that point, it seemed to me that it had been a kind of entirely haphazard process. And some parts of the society, some interest groups within the society, were getting quite frequent opportunities to have distinguished speakers come and talk, while other parts of the society languished with relatively few opportunities. So what we did in those years was actually have a plan cycling through a period of 3 to 5 years in which essentially all of the major interest groups and the divisions and institutes of the society had an opportunity to nominate a keynote speaker or more than one keynote speaker at times. And I think the quality of keynote speakers has improved a great deal as well, partly because we actually specified that in order to be invited as a keynote speaker, you had to actually have some credibility in that role, which wasn't always clear beforehand either. So from that perspective, again, I think if nothing else has changed in the last decade or so, it's been that if you go to a New Zealand Psychological Society conference, you will hear a number of extremely good keynotes representing cutting-edge research and often challenging theories as well. So I think that, as long as we can maintain this sort of new balance, though it's no longer particularly new, where the needs of applied and professional psychologists for workshops and for technical and professional skills and information are balanced against the continuing need for psychologists to know about contemporary research and theory. If we can maintain this balance, I think the future of the Society's commitment to research will remain good. Thank you.